For decades, when people speak of Marilyn Monroe, the same image almost always comes to mind. Blonde hair, a seductive smile, a beauty so powerful it once made all of Hollywood stop and stare. And yet, there is something deeply strange about it all. The more famous Marilyn Monroe became, the more misunderstood she seemed to be. She was celebrated as a symbol of desire, but rarely recognized as a whole human being. People talked about her endlessly, but seldom asked a simpler, more difficult question. What was Marilyn Monroe's life actually like from the inside? There are people who spend an entire era walking beneath blinding lights. But when those lights finally fade, what remains is not glory. It is exhaustion, loneliness, and the quiet feeling of never having been allowed to be oneself. Marilyn Monroe's story is not merely the story of a Hollywood star. It is the story of a woman trapped inside an image the world created, and forced to pay for that image day after day, year after year, in silence. In this video, we will not retell Marilyn Monroe's life as a familiar film filled with dramatic highs and inevitable tragedy. Instead, we will look again, more slowly, more calmly, and more fairly, to understand why a woman who seemed to possess everything fame could offer never truly found peace, and to confront a question that sounds simple yet has never been easy to answer. Was Marilyn Monroe someone the whole world loved, or someone the whole world profoundly misunderstood? In the collective memory of the 20th century, Marilyn Monroe was never just a famous actress. She became a cultural symbol, an image instantly recognizable even at a fleeting glance. Marilyn Monroe was born on June 1st, 1926, in Los Angeles, California. Yet strangely enough, that very human detail, her date of birth, is rarely remembered. Because in the public imagination, Marilyn never quite seemed to be born the way ordinary people are. She appeared on the screen as if she had already been a legend. To audiences of Hollywood's golden age, Marilyn Monroe embodied a very particular kind of beauty: feminine, soft, alluring, without sharpness, sensual, yet never distant. She was not a star admired from afar. Marilyn was someone people felt drawn toward. The way she smiled, the way she spoke, the slight hesitation before the camera, all of it created the feeling that Marilyn was not performing a role, but revealing a genuine fragility. That fragility is what etched her image into the memory of an entire generation. Not because she starred in an endless series of great films, but because she came to represent a feeling deeply familiar to that era: gentleness, the need for protection, and a longing to be loved in a world just emerging from the shadow of war. But public memory has another side. People remember Marilyn Monroe as an almost unchanging image: blonde hair, a smile that hovered between shyness and seduction. A version of femininity Hollywood repeated again and again. Over time, Marilyn in the public eye ceased to be a woman with a birthday, an age, and a private life. She became a template, an image adored by millions, yet held within a very narrow frame. And here, a paradox quietly took shape. The entire world felt it knew Marilyn Monroe, yet very few truly knew who she was beyond what that image allowed them to see. This public memory would become the crucial backdrop for understanding why Marilyn Monroe's life in the years that followed turned into a constant struggle between the real woman and the image the world had already decided to love. To understand why Marilyn Monroe became the woman the world eventually saw, we must return to a time far removed from glamour: her childhood. From the very beginning, Marilyn Monroe grew up in instability. She did not have a real family to hold on to, no permanent home, and no sense of safety that many people take for granted. Her childhood unfolded across foster homes and temporary households. The constant leaving, the constant adjusting, shaped a very particular way of being in the world. Always watching others first, always trying to please, always afraid of being left behind. This is not tragedy told for dramatic effect. It is psychological groundwork. When a child grows up never knowing where they will be tomorrow, they learn to survive through sensitivity. They read adults' faces. They adjust their behavior to earn acceptance. Marilyn Monroe carried those skills with her into adulthood, and what matters most is this. She did not grow up dreaming of becoming a symbol or a star. What Marilyn longed for was far simpler: to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to remain in a relationship without the fear of being replaced. So when Hollywood appeared as a world willing to offer her attention, to offer her its gaze, to offer her the feeling of being needed, Marilyn Monroe entered it not only with professional ambition, but with a deeply human desire to belong. That anchorless childhood did not determine Marilyn Monroe's fate, but it explains a great deal. It explains why she constantly sought reassurance from the outside world. It explains why the spotlight was both the place that sustained her and the place where she was most vulnerable. And from this foundation, Marilyn Monroe's path into Hollywood would not simply be the rise of a star, but the journey of a human being trying to find ground solid enough to stand on in a world that had never truly felt stable to her. As the early 1950s began, Hollywood was entering a very particular moment in its history. The war had receded into memory, and only a few years after America emerged from the smoke and ruin, audiences began searching for something different. Images that felt gentler, easier to love. Faces that could offer comfort, daydreams, and hope. And that was when Marilyn Monroe arrived, at exactly the right time. Around 1950, Marilyn was not yet a major star. She appeared in small roles, sometimes only briefly, but enough to leave audiences with a lingering sense that something distinctly different had just crossed the screen. Marilyn was not the actress with the most intricate technique, nor did she possess the sharp, commanding beauty of many stars of her era. But she had something Hollywood desperately needed at that moment, a presence impossible to ignore. The camera seemed to fall in love with Marilyn, not because she tried to seduce it, but because every movement, the tilt of her head, the blink of an eye, even the smallest hesitation between lines, created a feeling of vulnerability, closeness, and emotional openness. This was not something learned in acting school. It was shaped by life itself, by years of adapting, observing, waiting to be accepted. Between 1951 and 1952, Marilyn began receiving roles that made her more memorable to the public. Supporting parts gradually gave way to leading roles built around a familiar image, a woman who was gentle, sensual, slightly naive, and often in need of saving. By 1953, everything shifted. Marilyn Monroe's name appeared more frequently on posters, in newspapers, and in theaters filled to capacity. From that moment on, she was no longer just a promising face. She became a formula for success. Hollywood quickly understood one simple truth: Marilyn Monroe sold tickets, not because of complex scripts, but because audiences wanted to see her, wanted to linger a little longer inside the atmosphere she created. Between 1953 and 1955, Marilyn's career rose at remarkable speed. Studios began building projects around her image. The press mentioned her name constantly. The public grew accustomed to seeing Marilyn as an inseparable part of the era itself. Yet precisely during this period, when everything appeared to be going perfectly, something crucial was also taking shape, quietly, almost unnoticed. Marilyn Monroe was not only climbing toward the peak of her career, she was also stepping into a frame Hollywood was perfectly content with, a frame the public embraced without hesitation. But Marilyn herself was never truly asked whether she wanted to remain inside that frame for the rest of her life. And from that moment on, Marilyn Monroe's success was no longer simply the story of talent meeting opportunity. It became a silent exchange, fame in return for freedom, adoration in return for the right to be oneself. This exchange did not cause an immediate collapse, but it was signed very early, when Marilyn Monroe was still shining in the brightest years of the 1950s, and from that foundation, the greatest conflicts of her life would slowly emerge. When Marilyn began to realize that the very thing that made her most loved was also the thing that made it increasingly difficult for her to step outside the image she had become. By the time Marilyn Monroe entered her 30s, she had reached a place many people never touch in an entire lifetime, a name instantly familiar to the public, an image that guaranteed box office success, and a glow that, from the outside, seemed to offer no reason to ever walk away. Yet, it was precisely at this stage, when a person begins to understand who they are and who they are no longer, that Marilyn started to feel a clear difference between success and freedom. In the early years, Marilyn was seen as a discovery. She was allowed to experiment, allowed to be inexperienced, allowed to make mistakes, and then grow from them. But once her image became familiar, the space began to close. The scripts coming her way grew alarmingly similar. The same kind of femininity, the same carefully staged fragility, the same roles that audiences could easily love, and just as easily forget that behind them was a woman still growing day by day. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly enough for Marilyn to realize that the very roles which once made her beloved were now keeping her in place. And this is a feeling many adults recognize. After spending years building a stable position, you suddenly realize that this very position no longer allows you to change without paying a price. Marilyn did not want to abandon the spotlight. She simply wanted to grow within it. That very human desire became a quiet turning point in her career. There was no scandal, no public failure, only a pause long enough to ask a difficult question. Was she continuing to perform for the audience, or continuing to perform a role that she herself was growing tired of? From that moment on, the line between before and after became clear. Before, Marilyn was considered easy to work with, as long as she preserved the image everyone expected to see. Afterward, she began to ask questions about motivation, about depth, and about whether she was still being seen as an actress, or merely as an image meant to be repeated for safety. That change in how Marilyn approached her roles triggered a change in how the system viewed her. Desires for greater challenge were not always understood as signs of growth. At times, they were interpreted as a lack of control, instability, or an unnecessary risk. At this stage, the greatest pressure did not come from the press or the spotlight. It came from a deeply personal question. If she changed, would the people who once loved her still recognize her at all? Marilyn had not withdrawn, but the belief that, if I just try a little harder, everything will be fine, had begun to fracture. And from there, the darker side of fame no longer lay in visibility itself, but in this quiet realization. Being loved for an image, while the real person inside slowly loses the space to speak. That feeling did not break Marilyn Monroe immediately. But it stayed with her for a long time, long enough to guide her toward far more difficult decisions in the chapters of life that followed. As the stage lights grew ever brighter, Marilyn Monroe's private life became the place where she searched most desperately for peace. Not romance, not love affairs splashed across headlines, but something far more basic: the feeling of being beside someone without having to perform. Marilyn married for the first time while she was still very young, before the world knew the name Marilyn Monroe as a symbol. The man beside her did not belong to Hollywood, did not live under the lights, and was not prepared to walk alongside someone on the brink of fame. That marriage felt like a temporary shelter, a place where a girl who had grown up without safety hoped to find simple protection. But as her career began to rise, the distance between their lives became impossible to ignore. One person stepped into the light. The other was left behind. And in that situation, love alone was not enough to keep two people in the same world. When Marilyn became a star known across America, she entered a very different kind of relationship. This time, not simplicity, but intellect, discipline, and the stature of the intellectual world. Marilyn believed that if she stood beside someone who valued thought and depth, she would no longer be seen as merely an image. But what she was searching for was gentleness. While her partner loved through reason and distance, there was no lack of respect between them. But they spoke different emotional languages. And when two people cannot meet at the same rhythm, loneliness can appear even while they are still living together. That marriage ended not through betrayal or scandal, but through a quiet recognition. There are people worthy of deep respect, yet unable to be a place of rest. Later, Marilyn found herself with a man who understood the pressure of fame, understood the artist's world, and was no stranger to extreme emotions. In this relationship, Marilyn hoped she would not have to explain herself constantly, not have to make herself smaller, not have to be a symbol. But when two people each carry their own instability and powerful egos, love can easily become a site of collision rather than a place of balance. Marilyn did not lack relationships in her life. Some came out of admiration, some came from a desire to protect, and some arrived quickly, only to leave just as fast. What hurt Marilyn most was not the leaving itself, but the recurring feeling. She was always chosen at her brightest, yet rarely allowed to stay when she was no longer strong. This is a feeling many adults understand deeply. After many relationships, you realize what you lack is not love, but a place safe enough to finally let go. And when private life no longer offers support, all professional pressure, all long-accumulated insecurity begins to turn inward. Marilyn entered a period where loneliness did not come from being alone, but from the feeling that there was nowhere she could exist fully as herself. From here on, the mental unrest that had been smoldering for years would no longer remain only in her thoughts. It began to affect her sleep, her daily rhythm, and her ability to stand steady beneath the weight of her own fame. When private life no longer offered a place to return to, and work no longer carried the feeling of growth, Marilyn Monroe's inner world was left to carry the rest. Her collapse did not arrive as a clear-cut event. There was no explosion, no dramatic moment that startled the outside world. It came from very small things, long stretches of sleepless nights, mornings that began with exhaustion even before the day's work had started. In an environment where an image was expected to remain radiant at all times, Marilyn learned to conceal her fatigue remarkably well. She still showed up, still smiled, still completed her work in front of the camera. But behind that surface, tension was accumulating day after day. When sleep becomes a luxury, people begin searching for temporary ways to keep going. At first, it is simply to rest, to be able to continue working, to avoid disrupting the expectations placed upon them. The problem is this: temporary solutions, when prolonged, gradually replace the body's ability to self-balance. Many adults recognize this feeling. When we no longer rest in order to live, but rest only to gather enough strength to continue enduring. For Marilyn, the pressure did not come solely from work. It came from a deeper fear. If she stopped, would anyone still be waiting for her to return? That insecurity made it difficult for her to accept empty spaces, difficult to tolerate silence, and even harder to be alone with her own thoughts. Slowly, the boundary between rest and escape began to blur. Sleepless nights were no longer exceptions. They became a way of life. At this stage, Marilyn was not short of people around her, but she lacked those who could stay long enough to realize that what she needed was not praise or admiration, but a very basic sense of stability. This quiet collapse did not take away her talent. It simply made everything heavier. Each role required more effort than before. Each workday demanded more strength just to begin. And eventually, when the body has been speaking for too long without being heard, a person is forced to confront a very honest question. Am I living to continue meeting expectations? Or am I slowly losing the ability to live for myself? This was not the end of Marilyn Monroe's story, but it was the point where everything began to shift. From here on, her choices would no longer be guided by ambition or glory, but by a deeply human need to stop, to breathe, and to exist without having to brace herself against the world every single day. By the early 1960s, when Marilyn Monroe was no longer a new face in Hollywood, her position began to change, quietly. Her name was still powerful enough to draw attention, but within the industry, the trust once placed in her was no longer intact. New projects arrived more slowly. Contracts grew tighter, and every plan came with a backup option, something Marilyn had never had to face before. During these months, chronic lateness and difficulty completing shoots became more serious, not due to a lack of effort, but because her body and mind could no longer keep pace with the demands of the work. Studios began to view Marilyn as a risk, not in headlines but in silent decisions, delays, script changes, contingency casting. The protection once extended to her gradually disappeared. Those who had once been willing to wait now prioritized schedules over compassion. At the same time, Marilyn's personal life narrowed. Close relationships grew fragile. Trust eroded after repeated disappointments. She was not alone, but increasingly lacked those close enough to truly understand the state she was in. During this period, Marilyn often spoke of wanting to work more seriously, to take part in projects with depth, to be recognized as an actress in the fullest sense, not merely as a familiar image. But when she needed patience from the system, what she received instead was caution. Hollywood did not turn its back on Marilyn in a single day. It simply withdrew its support, slowly. Her fame remained, but her control was almost gone. And when a person is both exhausted and isolated within their own work, every misstep, no matter how small, becomes harder to recover from. By this point, the question was no longer whether Marilyn had talent. That had been proven long ago. The question was this: could a person already worn thin continue to survive inside a system that did not allow for slowing down? And this is where Marilyn Monroe's life moved very close to its final chapter. Not through a dramatic moment, but through the gradual depletion of her capacity to endure. By that point, Marilyn Monroe no longer stood beneath the spotlight with its familiar sense of safety. She entered the final days of her life in a state of prolonged exhaustion, not because of a single great failure, but because she had been holding herself together for far too long without a true place to lean on. And then, in August of 1962, her story came to an end. Marilyn Monroe died at the age of 36. The official statement later cited a drug overdose as the cause. There was no long declaration, no complete explanation capable of easing the shock that gripped the public at the time. But if we stop Marilyn's story here, we would be repeating the very thing she endured throughout her life, being reduced to a single moment. Her death quickly became the center of attention. The press spoke endlessly, the public asked questions, and over time, speculation began to overshadow the woman herself. Yet what truly matters is not how she died. What deserves far more attention is how she lived before everything ended. Marilyn was not a symbol born from tragedy. She was a human being who worked relentlessly, who sought to be taken seriously, who tried to learn, to change, and to step beyond the frame imposed upon her. In her final years, Marilyn was not searching for attention. She was searching for peace, a slower rhythm of life, a space where she did not have to constantly prove her worth. Her death, therefore, should not be seen as the climax of her story. It is not the most important part, and it certainly is not what defines who she was. What defines Marilyn Monroe does not lie in that final day, but in the entire journey that came before it. A journey marked by effort, by wounds, and by a deep longing to live truthfully as herself. As the story reaches this point, what remains is not curiosity, but a necessary silence, one that allows us to remember Marilyn not as a tragedy, but as a person who lived fully within circumstances that were never easy. As the controversies slowly fade, as time creates enough distance, the most important question is no longer how Marilyn Monroe died. The question lies elsewhere. Why is it that after so many decades, her image continues to return, not only on screens, but in the memory of generation after generation? Perhaps because Marilyn was never a perfect symbol. She did not represent cold strength, nor was she the model of someone who controlled her life to the very end. What makes people remember Marilyn is her deeply human fragility. A woman trying to do her work well in a world that did not allow her to slow down. She lived in an era where women were expected to shine, but were not permitted to be tired, to be admired, but not allowed to ask too much for themselves. Looking back, Marilyn is not only a story of Hollywood, she is the story of those who have gone very far, who have given a great deal, and who eventually realize that the price paid can be far greater than what outsiders ever see. Perhaps that is why Marilyn Monroe does not need to be remembered as a tragedy, nor does she need to be mythologized. She only needs to be remembered as a human being who lived honestly under conditions that were never easy. If this story leaves us with anything, it is not a final judgment of right or wrong. It is a pause, one that invites each of us to ask, do we remember someone for their brilliance or for what they endured in order to remain themselves? Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If Marilyn Monroe left you with a feeling or a thought, please share it in the comments below. And if you would like to continue listening to stories told slowly, with respect, and a clear-eyed look at the human being behind the fame, stay with the channel by liking the video and subscribing so we can keep exploring these stories together. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.